I think we're good to go, John. Let's get started.
Okay, great. Well, hey, thanks, Kate. And I'm John Lawrence, Executive Director of Sycamore Land Trust, and very glad to welcome everyone to our conservation conversation. I have to say that very carefully. It's a tongue twister, but really good. And tonight we are really lucky to have Dr. Kimberly Novick talking about nature-based climate solutions in Indiana and beyond. So I would just like to give a little introduction to Sycamore Land Trust. For those who don't know, we are a nonprofit conservation organization founded in 1990 as an all-volunteer project, and now we have staff, and we serve 26 counties in southern Indiana. We protect land and restore natural habitat by owning and caring for nature preserves, and also by holding conservation easements that protect privately owned properties. We care for our nature preserves by restoring natural habitat and maintaining trails for free public use. Love for y'all to come out and see our nature preserves. We now protect over 140 properties, totaling over 11,000 acres in southern Indiana. And we have an education program that, in addition to the trails that we have programs that connect people of all ages to nature through guided hikes and all sorts of outdoor and indoor learning opportunities. I'd also add, for tonight, that Sycamore's work addresses climate resiliency in many ways. We preserve forests and plant trees, which sequester carbon. We protect and restore wetlands that mitigate flooding from major rain events, while also enhancing water quality and providing habitat for many, threatened species. And I'm sure our guest speaker tonight might have more thoughts of how our work impacts climate resiliency. So I will pass it along. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. We're just delighted to be co-hosting this event with the Sycamore Land Trust. It's really great to see so many people joining us tonight. I think we're all in for a treat. I'd like to take just a few minutes to share with you a little bit about Citizens Climate Lobby, or CCL for short. I've had the pleasure of volunteering with CCL since 2013 and currently serve as the state coordinator in Indiana. CCL is a nonprofit, nonpartisan, grassroots climate advocacy organization. We are focused on national policies to address the global climate crisis. Here in Indiana, we have 11 chapters working in all 9 U.S. congressional districts to build the political will for federal action on climate change. We do this through grassroots outreach, like tonight's program, or tabling at events. We do media work, we hold meetings with community leaders, and importantly, we persistently lobby Congress for meaningful action. Tonight, we have staff from several of our congressional offices joining us, and we thank you for taking the time to learn more and for engaging with us as we find common ground in addressing climate change. Our volunteers include everyone from high school students to concerned grandparents, farmers, climate scientists, Democrats, Republicans, and everyone in between. Whatever our backgrounds, we're all united by a commitment to making our voices heard as we call for a healthy climate. And we're experiencing success. Our volunteers made nearly 250,000 contacts with members of Congress working to get the Inflation Reduction Act passed into law. While this is the single biggest climate change legislation passed ever, anywhere, The science tells us more is needed to avert the most devastating impacts of climate change. Just this past Monday, Representative Carbajal from California introduced the bill that has been the focus of our lobbying efforts for a decade, the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. In short, the EICDA would put a steadily rising price on potential carbon emissions at the source and return those revenues to households, ensuring that low and moderate income households do not bear the burden of addressing climate change. In the previous Congress, through our lobbying efforts, this bill had nearly 100 co-sponsors. We'll be working hard to build on that number and get this bill passed into law. The climate news has been heartbreaking, with people and other living beings suffering and dying from the impacts of a changing environment all over the world and right here in Indiana. But I firmly believe the best antidote to despair is taking action. And I'm ever grateful to get to work with people who certainly feel despair at times, but also actively work toward creating a better tomorrow by consistently taking actions, big and small. If you're interested in learning more about Citizens Climate Lobby, I encourage you to check out our website, attend an info session, or join your local chapter at the next meeting. All right, at this point, I'll turn it over to Jeff White, a fellow CCL volunteer, who will introduce our presenter. Thank y'all.
Thank you, Marcia. So yes, I'm Jeff White, retired faculty member from Indiana University and a longtime colleague of our speaker this evening. I am also a supporting member of Sycamore Land Trust and, as Marcia said, the Citizens Climate Lobby. And it's my distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. Kimberly Novick, Kim to her students, colleagues, and friends. And Kim is a highly accomplished scholar and educator, beginning her career earning a BS and Ph.D. from Duke University in the fields of engineering and environmental science, and then completing a postdoc with the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Southern Research Station. We convinced Kim to join the environmental science faculty at IU in 2012, and she quickly became a shining star in our program. She's a highly accomplished researcher, receiving several all-university awards from IU, and most impressively, several of the nation's most prestigious early career awards in the sciences. Kim is also a consummate educator and mentor, teaching highly successful courses in applied mathematics, hydrology, forest ecology and management, and general environmental science. And she has won numerous teaching awards for this work. Finally, and most relevant to this evening's program, Kim was lead author of a recent national report on the science needed for nature-based climate solutions in the US. And we're fortunate to have Kim here this evening to address this very important and timely issue. So Kim, welcome and thank you for being here this evening. And a note to our audience, our host this evening will be monitoring the chat for questions from the audience. So please feel free to use this function for your questions, as audience microphones will be muted. And immediately after Kim's formal presentation, there will be a Q&A session where the host will direct your questions submitted in advance as well as during this evening's session to Kim for her to address. So thank you very much. And Kim, the floor is yours.
All right, well, thank you for the very kind introduction, Jeff, and thanks to the Sycamore Land Trust and the Citizens Climate Lobby for the opportunity to be here tonight. Excited to talk about one of my favorite topics, nature-based climate solutions, to an audience that I think mostly lives in Indiana, which is a place where I think many of these strategies are actually a really good idea. So with that, I'm gonna jump right in. With a bit of a roadmap. I'm going to start the presentation with just a little bit of perspective on my broader field of scientific inquiry and how it came to be that a lot of the attention of me and my collaborators is now very focused on nature-based strategies to mitigate climate change. Then we're going to walk through what some of those strategies are. We're going to talk about some of the reasons why they tend to engender a lot of support from a lot of different sectors, but also some reasons why they tend to be somewhat controversial. And then the last section will just be discussing some ways that we can really leverage the best available science to close the knowledge gaps that we need to address in order to create more robust and credible nature-based climate solution policy for the United States. So I'm going to start with what I think are sort of two fundamental mantras for scientists all over the globe who study terrestrial carbon cycling and ecosystem ecology. And the first is that right now we are sure that terrestrial ecosystems, largely forests, but also grasslands and some croplands and wetlands, provide us with a huge discount on our anthropogenic emissions of CO2. So what I mean is that they are an important sink for emissions of CO2 to the atmosphere that cause climate change, the bulk of which come from fossil fuel burning. That's the gray blob here, but some of which come from land use change, primarily deforestation, primarily in the tropics. So this is what we send into the atmosphere, here shown on an annual time scale. And then these blobs down here represent the fate of those emissions. So we can start with the dark blue blob, which is the ocean carbon sink. Every year, oceans take out about 25 or 30% of the anthropogenic emissions that we put into the atmosphere. So thank you, oceans. Without the oceans, climate already would have warmed much more than it has to date. The green blob is the terrestrial carbon sink. You'll notice it's a little bit more variable than the ocean carbon sink, and that is because the terrestrial carbon sink is very sensitive to interannual variability and meteorological conditions. Nonetheless, in the mean, it too removes 25 or 30% of, or an amount of CO2 equal to 25 or 30% of our anthropogenic emissions every year. So thank you, terrestrial ecosystems. Without terrestrial ecosystems, it would already be much hotter than it is today. And then the light blue blob is what stays in the atmosphere and drives climate change. Just very briefly, how does the land sink work? I'm gonna give a forest-oriented perspective here, just because forests tend to predominate the terrestrial carbon sink, but just to make sure we're all on the same page. Green vegetation on land and in water, but particularly on land, is extremely effective at removing CO2 from the atmosphere through photosynthesis. And so annually, terrestrial plants remove on the order of 440 gigatons of CO2 per year. I'm going to put that number in context in a minute, but it's a lot. And so that CO2 comes into the plant where it gets redistributed into various biomass pools, maybe the leaves or the branches or the stems or the roots. And some of that carbon also gets exuded out of the roots where it feeds microbial life in the soil. Almost all of the carbon that is assimilated by photosynthesis is respired back to the atmosphere, either through plant respiration or respiration of these heterotrophs in the soil. And that amounts to something like 430 gigatons of CO2 per year, which is close to, but not quite equal to the gross photosynthesis flux, so that there is a net imbalance of 10 or 11 gigatons of carbon dioxide every year, which is small. That's a small number when compared to these gross fluxes. But when we compare this number to our annual emissions of anthropogenic CO2, we can see that they are much more similar, right? So this is where that 25 or 30% estimate I gave on the last slide comes from. All right, so the balance between these two huge fluxes is a very important part of what's driving, or it's a very important buffer, right, against anthropogenic emissions of CO2 to the atmosphere. But because this number is such a small difference between two large numbers, that means any change in meteorological conditions or climate that affects photosynthesis more than CO2, or vice versa, will end up having a big change on the net number, right? There's a lot of sensitivity baked into this system, all right? So this is sort of discussing what happens on in a given year. It's also important to have longer timescales in mind when we think about nature-based climate solutions in the terrestrial carbon sink. So here, in the case of forests, we need to consider the fact that when forests are regrowing, They are in a phase of carbon uptake and storage, and tend to be, particularly in places like Indiana, fairly strong and stable carbon sinks. But forests are also very sensitive to disturbance, for example, from wildfire or insect outbreaks or drought-driven mortality, which can quickly turn the sink into a source. Over time, natural succession tends to proceed, and once again, the land area can become a carbon sink. But we need to keep this sort of boom and bust cycle in mind, particularly as the frequency of these disturbance events is expected to increase. So the next mantra, so we've established that terrestrial ecosystems provide us with this huge discount on our anthropogenic emissions of CO2. But the other mantra is, to be quite honest, we really don't know what is the future fate of this carbon sink. And that is because it integrates a large number of very complex climate feedbacks, which are difficult to predict and represent in models. So for example, on the one hand, as atmospheric CO2 continues to rise, this will tend to increase photosynthesis and probably more than it increases respiration. On the other hand, because respiration depends exponentially on temperature, as temperature rises, it should increase respiration quite a bit. However, rising temperature, particularly in deciduous forests, also tends to create longer growing seasons, which could lead to more photosynthesis. Over longer timescales, and as I alluded to already, climate change is expected to promote more wildfire, more insect outbreaks, and more drought-driven tree mortality, which will affect the timescales of these boom and bust periods. And this is certainly an incomplete list of climate feedbacks that can affect terrestrial plants. But the long and short of it is, there is a tremendous amount of uncertainty in our ability to predict the future fate of the terrestrial carbon sink. So what you see here on the x-axis is time, and on the y-axis is modeled projections of the global land carbon sink, integrating projections from a large number of individual models. And the blue blob is sort of a kind of best case scenario at this point for where we're headed in terms of CO2 emissions. And then the red blob is the worst case scenario. And in fact, there's not a tremendous difference, certainly a meaningful difference, not a tremendous difference between the mean, the multi-model mean for these two scenarios. But the story here is all about the uncertainty, the range of the shaded areas, which is extremely large, right? Maybe our terrestrial ecosystems will go on to become very, very strong carbon sinks in the future, or maybe they will switch and become carbon sources. We simply do not know. Okay. It's a major problem that we don't know because this is such a huge part of the carbon cycle. It is difficult to create confident predictions of what future temperature will be when there's so much uncertainty around the land carbon sink. So to address this major, research challenge, we have invested, collectively and globally, huge amounts of time and resources and energy in developing what are really an extremely useful set of state-of-the-art scientific tools for monitoring terrestrial carbon cycling. Some of them may be more familiar to you than others. At the scale of individual plots, individual trees. We can do things like take forest inventories, measurements of diameter and height, which we can feed through empirical models to estimate standing carbon stocks. We can certainly also remove soil cores, take them back to the laboratory and measure the amount of carbon contained in those cores. At ecosystem scales, one of the most useful tools are so-called flux towers. This is actually the bread and butter of my lab's research. And so I want to take a second just to explain what these are. You can think of them as fancy meteorological stations. Sometimes they're very big. This is our flux tower out in Morgan Monroe State Forest in South Central Indiana, where at the top we have a set of instruments that permits us to measure continuously and at the scale of the entire ecosystem, the net movement of CO2 between the atmosphere and the canopy and the ecosystem, right? So we are measuring directly at the scale of the entire forest stand or the entire farm field or the entire pasture, how much CO2 is moving in between the air and the land every half hour. These are expensive to operate, but their temporal resolution is really quite useful for understanding that sensitivity to meteorological conditions. And moreover, we have aggregated data from flux towers all over the country and all over the world into these flux tower networks. So I think there's easily more than 1,000 active flux towers across the globe at this point. Moving up, we have tools emerging like near surface remote sensing, networks not only of flux towers, but also forest inventory networks. And then at the global scale, we have an increasingly rich amount of information available from satellite remote sensing that tells us not just the usual things like how green the land surface is, or perhaps how tall the trees are, but also now is providing us with direct information about the function of these ecosystems. Right? So it's an exciting time to be an ecosystem carbon scientist. So just to summarize here, we know right now that terrestrial ecosystems are a crucial carbon sink. We do not know the fate of that carbon sink into the future. But a question that we are beginning to ask more frequently and more urgently is, nonetheless, even though we can't predict the global carbon sink into the future, do we know enough to understand the potential for changes in ecosystem management to increase the size of the sink now and into the future? It's a different question, right? We are not now necessarily interested in predicting with precision the magnitude of the carbon sink writ large. We are now interested in understanding, can specific management interventions increase the size of that sink? And so that brings us to the topic of nature-based climate solutions and the second part of the talk. And I think I summarized once already, but the other thing I just want to really hammer home before we move on is that the importance of solving this research challenge of predicting the land sink into the future has again just produced a really wide array of monitoring tools and models and data information systems that have definitely not yet been fully leveraged to understand the potential for nature-based climate solutions. Okay. So let's move on to those. I suspect that many of you have heard of these ideas before. Sometimes they go by different names, natural climate solutions or climate smart management or even carbon farming. But they tend to all refer to the notion that we might manage our ecosystems differently in ways that either enhance their ability to sequester and store carbon dioxide, or that reduce emissions of CO2 and other non-CO2 greenhouse gases like methane and nitrous oxide, which tend to be particularly important in agricultural systems and wetlands. And these strategies can fall into sort of three categories. On the one hand, we have strategies like avoided deforestation, wetland and grassland conversion, which fall under the auspice of protection or conservation. On the other end of this spectrum, we have restorative activities, including reforestation and wetland restoration. And then here in the middle, we have a variety of strategies really related to how we manage our working lands, including altered forest harvest schedules, cover crops, reduced tillage or no-till agriculture, and then some strategies that I have to say sort of blend the or span the gap between sort of natural and engineered climate solutions, but the example being the addition of things like biochar or crushed silicate rock to our landscapes, which can enhance the ability of the soils to store CO2 in the long term. Okay. I'm going to focus on a couple of strategies more than once throughout this talk, so I just want to introduce them briefly right here. These tend to be strategies that are among the most viable right now for Indiana and sort of the eastern United States in general. The first is cover cropping. Again, most of you may know what this is, but just in case you don't, this is the practice of planting a non-harvestable crop like cereal rye or some legume mixture that tends to grow when farm fields are otherwise bare. I think most farmers that use cover crops are actually seeding them right now. And then once they harvest the corn and the soy, the cover crops will sort of have a running start on establishment heading into the late fall, where they'll remain on the landscape until they are terminated before planting in April or May. The cover crops are well known to provide really important benefits for soil health and water quality. And the hypothesis is that they may also provide a climate benefit by allowing the landscape to photosynthesize longer than it would otherwise every year. Okay. Another really, I think, important nature-based climate solution for Indiana is reforestation, where we can cover the land use history of the East United States in 30 seconds. It would begin sometime before colonization, when the landscape was dominated by forests pretty much everywhere east of the Mississippi. These are forests that were very sustainably managed by indigenous tribes through tools like selective harvest and prescribed fire. But as European colonizers moved west, we were very effective at removing trees from the landscape. Indiana lost more than 90% of its forest cover in the 19th and early 20th century. In around the 1920s or 1930s, the combination of the Dust Bowl era droughts and severe soil degradation and the Depression caused widespread agricultural abandonment of less productive farms, which over the last century have regrown back into forest. However, the amount of forest cover in the East United States and Indiana remains nowhere near what it was a few hundred years ago. Okay. So there's also to say there is room. There is room for these landscapes to reforest to the ecosystems that dominated them, the land for millennia. It is important to recognize that nature-based climate solutions are not a panacea for climate change. The way to solve climate change is to reduce anthropogenic emissions of CO2 and eventually eliminate them. That is the answer. However, most consensus-driven reports agree that in the near term, we also need strategies to remove CO2 from the atmosphere, and nature-based climate solutions are one such strategy. In addition to any benefits they might confer in terms of reduced emissions of methane and nitrous oxide. So they are part of most pathways to limit warming to 1.5 or even 2 degrees C. Most of these strategies, particularly the ones that are restorative, that are conservative, or that have known benefits for things like soil health, are associated with a wide array of well-known environmental code benefits, right? And certainly there is much justification for implementing these strategies on the basis of their co-benefits alone. Some may also be tools for climate adaptation, which is a little bit different than climate mitigation. You know, when we talk about mitigation, we're really talking about reducing, right, the accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, at least slowing the rate at which they are accumulating. Climate adaptation is more about allowing or permitting both natural and human systems to be better prepared for the warming that we know is coming ahead. So for example, there's evidence that cover crops may buffer farmlands against climate extremes, extreme temperature events, and extreme precipitation events. There's also evidence, and I'll show a little bit later in the talk, that trees can locally reduce both surface and air temperature. Okay. I just want to emphasize again that the fact that many of these strategies are restorative, and emphasize again that before we made a big mess of the climate system, we made a big mess of the land. When I showed this picture up here, which for those of you that are squinting to see what it is a huge float of logs moving down the Hudson River with these log drivers standing on top of these floating logs to remove any log jams. When I showed this picture to my son, who's now 13, he said, oh, well, that must be in the Amazon, but it wasn't. This was New York in the late 19th century. And it just, from my perspective, you know, the mess we made of the land and the mess we're making of the climate are very much interconnected problems. Nature-based climate solutions have a lot of support from what I would describe as a very unusual coalition. They receive a fair amount of support at the federal and state level from lawmakers on both sides of the political spectrum. So truly bipartisan support for many of these strategies. In fact, our Indiana senators have both within the past couple of years introduced major pieces of legislation into the Senate aimed at facilitating nature-based climate solutions. In 2022, we have seen tens of billions of federal dollars allocated for implementation of nature-based climate solutions, with every reason to expect that there is more to come. These strategies engender a lot of support from the private sector, and particularly companies and entities who are interested in meeting net zero targets, historically by offsetting hard to abate emissions through so-called carbon credits. Though also I think that many companies are generally interested in reducing their emissions, for the reasons that we hope that they would be. Conservation groups have a lot of support for these ideas for a number of reasons, but including also all of those environmental co-benefits. And these receive even, I would say, lukewarm support from farmers, foresters, and the agencies that represent them. Okay, so it's not very often that you see all of these sorts of actors sitting at the same table trying to advance the same goal, okay, especially not in the environmental sphere. All that said, this implementation is advancing on what I would describe as very shaky scientific footing, because how much additional mitigation can be accomplished with nature-based climate solutions is very much still an open question. What you see here is a study from a paper published a couple of years ago, where what the authors did is they went through and they found all the peer-reviewed journal articles that published an estimate of how much CO2 could be removed from the atmosphere if we deployed all of these nature-based climate solution strategies. And so they found 42 studies. So that's why you see 42 little bars on the x-axis here. And then the y-axis is the published estimate of the mitigation potential of these strategies, again, globally. And the point is, it's all over the place, right? What you see here is the shaded area that indicates the range of negative emissions necessary to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. A couple studies propose that nature-based climate solutions can get us above that bar. Most say they might help, but can't get us anywhere. Some of them say we can't really get anywhere close with nature-based climate strategies. And then some say that they could get us right on target. The truth is probably somewhere here in the middle, but where exactly is a question we do not yet know the answer to. Okay. There's also a tremendous amount of uncertainty about the mitigation potential of individual strategies. So what you see here is an estimate of the CO2 mitigation potential for different nature-based climate solutions, focusing specifically on the United States. There's a few things that are interesting about this figure. The first is that provided the price of carbon is high, let's just put it that way, reforestation is the strategy with the overall greatest mitigation potential. When the price of carbon is low, as it is today, it is actually cover crops that come out on top if you focus your attention just on these light green blobs. But what is really striking about the figure is the size of the error bars. Again, a tremendous amount of uncertainty concerning the amount of mitigation possible with these strategies. Okay. There are a range of policy mechanisms that could be used and are being used to implement them. We could consider performance or practice-based subsidies to landowners for doing a specific management practice. There are carbon market systems, more on that in a second. And some emerging approaches like climate smart commodity programs, which is an idea that's similar to USDA certified organic, right? If you go to the store, and I bet there are some people in the audience who buy organic food, you buy it and you pay more for it because it aligns with your value system. And so the idea here is that maybe we can extend a similar idea to commodities produced with so-called climate smart management practices, okay? But the truth is that so far, at least systematically and at global scales, the primary way that these strategies have been implemented is through carbon markets, where again, this is the idea that a private company, it's usually a private company will buy a carbon credit, which is generated through some sort of mitigation-based practice by a landowner somewhere else. This has kind of been a disaster. I don't know if you follow the trajectory of carbon markets, but basically the protocols for monitoring, reporting, and verifying the actual benefits of these projects are very diverse. They're non-standardized from one entity to the next and not interoperable, and they tend to use decades-old tools that do not incorporate the best available science. As a consequence, there are a growing number of reports of offset sales that were not additional or that were overcredited or that backfired. For example, a reforestation project simply going up in flames due to a wildfire. Okay, there is quite a bit of peer-reviewed literature that discusses some of the problems with the carbon market systems, but if you want a humorous yet, let's say, language-rich overview of the challenge, you can check out this episode of Last Week Tonight with John Oliver from last September. If any of you all watch his show, and again, I do want to caution that there is some language issues, but it is a good source of information. You know that things tend to have to be, let's say, pretty messed up to be the lead story on this news program. But carbon offsets were last fall. Okay. So to summarize part 2, nature-based climate solutions, for good reasons, often engender large amounts of enthusiasm from a really diverse set of actors, but they also generate large amounts of controversy. And I would argue that much of that controversy, and I will argue, in fact, in the third section, that much of that controversy relates to the fact that these programs are being implemented, or at least funding is being allocated at a pace that is well ahead of the science. However, if we can remember back to point 1, we have the tools we need, many of us believe, to close the knowledge gaps necessary to inform these strategies with better science. And exactly how we do that, and if we'll do that, is a major focus of our attention right now. And I do want to emphasize again that the co-benefits of many of these strategies are very well established, and there are many good reasons to deploy many of them broadly and aggressively across the landscape. The question is, to what extent should we be relying on them as tools to mitigate global warming? Okay. So with that, we'll go into the last section. What are some of the knowledge gaps, more specifically, that are preventing more certain estimates of the mitigation potential of these strategies? And here, at the beginning, Jeff mentioned that we authored a white paper report, which came out last fall, following on from a workshop on the same theme. And so a lot of what I'm going to share is in that report, and I'll be happy to throw the link into the chat. It comes in 3 flavors, very short, like 4 pages. Normal paper length for us scientists, which would take you about 20, 30 minutes to read. And then the very, very long version, which I would not encourage you to dive into first, unless you like things that are somewhat unpleasant. So stick with one of the shorter versions to start. Okay. The first thing that the report does is it identifies some criteria that must be met for nature-based climate solutions to succeed as mitigation tools. The first is that they must lead to enhancements to carbon uptake or reductions in emissions of greenhouse gases that are additional to what would have occurred otherwise, and that integrate over all ecosystem sources and sinks. Yeah, I'm going to say more about that in a minute. All right, but we want additional ecosystem scale benefits. They should lead to net cooling. And what we really mean here is that any benefits with respect to CO2 or other greenhouse gases should not be offset primarily by changes in albedo, which is the reflectivity of the land surface, which can sometimes be altered so much by a change in management practice that it overrides the mitigation benefits associated with the greenhouse gas abatement. Okay. Criteria 3, that the benefits should be durable. For how long is an open question, but 100 years is a good frame of reference, right? If we are going to grow a new forest to help mitigate climate change, that forest should be a forest for a timescale of a century or more, hopefully. And then finally, we need to account for leakage, which really means that gains in one area are not offset by simply shifting, harvesting, or land degradation to some other area. I'm not going to say much more about that. Actually, understanding leakage is really hard and is largely the purview of economists and people with skill sets beyond my own. But it is important to keep this in mind. Okay. So, scientists are very good at identifying problems. It's like our specialty. So the report identifies a whole bunch of things we don't know. A long list here, and this is the short list, okay? And I'm not going to go through all of these. I am going to say a few words about a few, But the truth is, you know, and we sort of tried to organize these gaps according to which type of ecosystems they apply to. But long and short of it is, there's a lot we don't know. But we don't want to just deliver bad news. So the report also discusses the things that we might do in order to close these knowledge gaps. Okay. So I'm going to start by saying a few words about ecosystem scale assessments. So I don't know how many of you have ever thought about how one might measure the change in carbon uptake, you know, over time in an ecosystem. But here's largely how it's done. Most of the time, when we are estimating carbon sequestration potential of terrestrial ecosystems, we are really focused on two very limited carbon pools. In grasslands and croplands, we tend to focus on the carbon contained in usually the top foot of the soil. Why? Because it's hard to measure carbon stored deeper. So we focus on the shallow 30 centimeters, and we tend to measure it through soil cores. Go out, grab some soil cores, take them back to the lab, measure the carbon content, come back in a few years, do it again, and calculate the difference. In forest, what we tend to do is focus on above ground tree biomass, right? So really the woody biomass of the trees that we can see above ground. And we estimate that by measuring tree diameter, which is pretty easy. Just throw a tape around a tree. Unless it's a big tree, then you need a helper. And usually also tree height. And we put those measurements into these very empirical equations, which were largely developed decades ago by trees that were harvested well before most of these climate feedbacks became important. Nonetheless, we put these measurements into those equations and we get an estimate of tree biomass, which we convert into an estimate of tree carbon. Again, we go away for a couple of years, come back, do it again, calculate the difference. Okay. The nice thing about these measurements is that they are relatively straightforward and they are familiar. However, there are some downsides. We may be missing important sources and sinks of carbon, for example, in deeper soil layers, in soils entirely in the forest. Soil carbon change in forests is usually ignored. And in also leaf litter and deadwood pools in forests. It can be very hard to design sampling strategies that can capture the heterogeneity within an ecosystem. These strategies really don't tell us much about methane or nitrous oxide or those albedo impacts. And it also takes a long time for carbon pools in these soils to respond to a treatment. Okay? So you have to wait 5 years to know if your management change is having any impact. We propose a need to sort of blend these pool or stock-based accounting approaches with flux-centric accounting. And so I'm going to attempt an analogy here where I want you to imagine that this pool represents all the places that carbon might stay over the long term in an ecosystem. So in the soils, or in the woody biomass, or in the dead woody biomass. And then the faucet is the movement of carbon between the atmosphere and the ecosystem, right? So if you're just focusing on the pool, it's a really pretty big pool. So even if it's increasing over time, you know, it just takes a long time to notice the change, right? It can take 5 years before you can see a signal emerge from the noise with these stock-based approaches, okay? Now imagine that we have implemented a nature-based climate solution, which has doubled the inflow rate. That's a good thing, right? This is more carbon moving from the atmosphere to the ecosystem. But again, because the pool is so large, it's going to take a long time to see that difference, right? So, however, we will immediately see the change in the faucet, right? So I'm just going to go back. We double the faucet. Wow, that was really obvious, but we still have to wait a long time to see the change in the pool. All right. So with some of the tools that we have at our disposal, those flux towers and many of those remote sensing products, it is now possible to pay attention to the faucet in addition to the pool, right? So when I say things like leveraging the best available science, what I mean is really throwing the book of all of these fancy toys at our understanding. Okay. And just a quick note that you know, when we focus on the faucet, we don't have to keep track of all those different pools in the ecosystem. However, the strategy can be compromised if we are losing carbon, for example, in runoff or loss to harvest. Because we need to keep track of what's coming in, but with also what's going out. So in that case, we either have to be able to account for these fluxes, or if we can't, then we really need to blend both flux and pool-based accounting. Okay, I hope that wasn't too much for this audience. You can see I feel very passionately about it. But what would this look like in practice? I'm gonna skip that. I want to visit our long-running flux tower in Morgan Monroe State Forest, which has been measuring the net flux of CO2 between the atmosphere and the ecosystem continuously since 1998. I did not build this tower. I was in high school in 1998, but I inherited it about a decade ago from my predecessors. Before I show you what the data look like, I want to just illustrate what the theory says we should expect carbon uptake to look like in this forest. This is a very lovely illustration from a paper published by Eugene Odom back in I think it was 1969, which is one of the most highly cited papers in ecosystem ecology. It predicts that as forest succession proceeds, initially, the ecosystem will be a carbon source. NEP here stands for net ecosystem productivity. When it's negative, the ecosystem is source. When it's positive, the ecosystem is a carbon sink. As succession proceeds, quickly the ecosystem becomes a sink. It peaks early in the mid-succession stage, and from there, the magnitude of the sink declines back towards zero once the forest is mature or approaching old growth age. Okay, but here are the data from Morgan Monroe State Forest, which is a forest that is, I think, 90 or 95 years old now, so definitely mature, a mature forest. The theory predicts that we should be seeing a decline in carbon uptake at this stage for this forest. What we see is a lot of variability in carbon uptake from year to year, but no evidence of a long-term decline. Okay. We also calculated carbon uptake the other way. So this is sort of the flux-based approach. And I will say that in this forest, we are not too concerned about lateral losses. And also we have an agreement with the DNR that they will not harvest in the footprint of the tower. So we're not too concerned about harvest either. We calculated carbon uptake the other way by hugging a bunch of trees and getting those diameter and height measurements and throwing them into the allometric models. And here's those results. You'll notice probably the first thing is the difference in magnitude. I do believe that difference reflects biases in the measurement approaches. There are reasons to think that the tower estimates might be biased a little high, and also reasons to expect that the allometric models are biased a little bit low, right? So the truth is somewhere in the middle. It's important, but what really strikes me about the figure is the clear trend coming from the allometric models, which we don't see in the tower data. And I will say that similar results have been obtained from other towers like ours across the Eastern United States. So what this means is that most of what we know about forest carbon uptake in the Eastern United States, which comes from models like these, is predicting that we are in sort of the decline phase for most of those forests that we generated in the 30s and 40s. However, the flux tower data suggests this is not the case, and resolving that discrepancy, I think, is a major challenge for our field. All right. I don't have too much more to tell you, but I am going to run through just a few more things about a few more of these knowledge gaps. I want to say something about representative data from working lands. I'm going back to this figure here, where remember we concluded that when the price of carbon is low, cover crops are one of the most viable mitigation strategies for the United States. Where did this number come from? Well, it mostly came from this paper, which was published in 2015. This was the most comprehensive synthesis of estimates of the change in soil carbon attributable to cover cropping available at the time. I think they had something like a little over 100 studies incorporated in the synthesis. Most of them, as you can see, had not been using cover crops for very long. And of these 100 or whatever studies, I believe 37 were located in the United States. Okay. Here's the data. Here's the fit and model that produces estimates like this. You can see that this fit is driven very much by these two studies on, decadal scale cover cropping. It'd be nice to have more data out here, but it'd be also nice to have more data in general, because if you think of all the different ways we might manage croplands in the United States, the different cash crop species that we might plant, the different tillage routines we might deploy, the different cover crop species we might use, And then think about all the broad gradients in climate and soils across the United States. 37 is nowhere near enough to capture that variability. We need a national, robust, and spatially representative soil carbon monitoring network. The good news is it looks like this might finally happen. We are not the first people to propose such a thing, but there is money allocated in the IRA to create something like this. A small amount relative to the amount going towards implementation of nature-based climate solutions. There's 300 million in the IRA for research on climate smart management versus 20 billion for implementation of the strategies, right? So those scales are a little bit unevenly tipped, but it looks like we will finally have a soil carbon monitoring network. I also want to just mention that we, thinking again about blending flux and stock-based accounting and generating more representative data, we do have a new project we just started to evaluate the climate mitigation and adaptation benefits of cover crops. What we've done is we've found 2 paired sites where we have a field that is conventionally managed and a field that is managed with cover crops. And in each of these site pairs, we are installing flux towers. We are also doing soil carbon sampling and measuring emissions with chambers in the soil, and we'll be doing near surface remote sensing and also monitoring the loss of carbon and the outflow through tile drains, which are very handy from a scientific perspective because they just direct all the water from these fields into this handy dandy little drain. We installed the flux towers earlier this year, and we're really looking forward to seeing the data from the first year of cover cropping roll in. This is expensive. It would cost quite a bit of money to do this in a lot of different places, but we will gain with this highly temporally representative data a better mechanistic understanding of how cover crops actually affect soil carbon cycling, among other things. Okay. I want to say a few words about these biophysical or albedo impacts. I've alluded to these already, but the main part of the story here is that forests are often darker than the ecosystems they replace. This is especially true in parts of the world where there is a persistent snowpack in winter, and whether the forest is evergreen or deciduous, it tends to still be much darker than bright white snow. It is also true in the tropics and in arid landscapes where forests are, again, just darker than whatever else you might see hanging around. I will say this is less true in Indiana and much of the Eastern United States, where our croplands and our grasslands tend to be pretty green. But in the event, when the surface is darker, it absorbs more incident solar radiation, whereas when it is brighter, more of that radiation is directed right back out into space, where it cannot contribute to climate change, right? So generally speaking, a darker surface is bad for the climate, okay, in isolation. All right, whereas a brighter surface, a shift from a darker surface to a brighter surface would represent a mitigation benefit, okay? So if we look at reforestation again, and now we are calculating the net climate impacts, considering first the change in radiative forcing, which we can convert to units of CO2 equivalents related to that change in albedo. You can see this is mostly red and orange, so not good. And then we can compare that to the largely blue, i.e. good benefits associated with greater forest carbon uptake, and then you take the difference. And I should say this is not my work. This is really great work done by my colleagues, but it does not involve our group. You add the two, and then you have the net cooling effect. And you can see that in some places, considering these albedo changes really changes the story on the mitigation potential of forests, particularly in the Western United States. In the Eastern United States, we're still blue, however you look at it. The same is true for most of the tropics. But in some places, arid landscapes and boreal landscapes, these albedo-driven impacts are really important. Another example on the bright side is this is work from my group. It's sort of hot off the press, so definitely it's still in prep. We haven't even submitted it yet, but we're pretty excited about what we see when we look at the albedo impacts of no-till and reduced-till agriculture, where just the punchline is that fields that experience no-till or conservation till tend to be substantially brighter than conventionally tilled fields. And now next time you're driving around southern Indiana, as I do often to go to these baseball tournaments, look out your window. See what you see when you see a field that is tilled and a field that has residue on it. And I think that you will be able to see this change in brightness with your own eyes. There's been a lot of discussion, a lot of ink spilled about whether no-till practices actually increase soil carbon. If we forget that for a minute and focus on the albedo benefits, we may have a much cleaner story. So hopefully we'll be able to get that out within a couple months. These albedo, or these sort of biophysical impacts can also affect the adaptation potential of these strategies. So lower albedo, which we see in some forests, tends to cause warming at local scales. Now, this is no longer climate mitigation, this is climate adaptation for the next few slides. So we're talking about local changes in temperature. If albedo is lower, the surface and probably the air tend to get warmer. However, if evapotranspiration, the return of water between ecosystems and the atmosphere, increases, this tends to cause cooling. And that's because just like when we sweat, because sweating produces water, which is then evaporated using energy that would otherwise be used to heat our bodies. So when evapotranspiration increases, for example, because there are simply more leaves on the land surface, it tends to have a local cooling effect. Also, forests tend to be more aerodynamically rough, which just means they generate more efficient eddies, which are better at directing heat away from the surface into the upper atmosphere, which also tends to have a local cooling effect at the surface. Okay. So, the interplay of these three factors will determine how a shift in land management affects the climate locally, right? Independently of background changes. And I've already told you this story, so I'm going to skip it. But remember that in the East United States, we've had sort of this pattern of reforestation over the last century, which you can see here mapped. Basically, the entire eastern U.S. Lights up green. Okay, reforestation is a big part of our land use history over the last 100 years. Curiously, if you go back long enough and look at temperature changes, we have not experienced very dramatic warming across much of the East United States in comparison to other parts of the world. And so the hypothesis is that maybe this pattern of reforestation has locally affected the rate of cooling. And this is a question that we have been answering over the past, gosh, seems like forever, but really, I guess 7 years. And we're finally about ready to wrap up the project with a paper under review by my collaborator, Mallory Barnes. But the punchline is, yes, in fact, there is a local cooling benefit associated with forests in this part of the world. This is some satellite data that shows surface temperature corrected by air temperature for forests on the top and grasslands and croplands on the bottom. And the point is the forest maps are bluer, particularly in the summertime. And if you sort of average across the entire study region and plot it as more of a time series, what you can see is that the actual magnitude here doesn't matter. What matters is the relative positioning between forests in blue, grasslands in yellow, and croplands in orange. And we can see that at least at the surface, forests are, sorry, I got a little misaligned with the axis labels here, but it's about, can be up to 2 degrees difference in surface temperature between forests and croplands. And I want to be clear here that this is the temperature that satellites can see from space. So it is the temperature of the top of the ecosystems, right? So this doesn't reflect the shading effect of forests in the under canopy. This is the temperature of the uppermost canopy leaves, which is still cooler for forests compared to croplands or grasslands. We also did work to understand to what extent this cooling benefit extends to the air, where it can be advected across the landscape and influence nearby, human populations. And what we find is that while the magnitude is lower, even for air temperature, there is a pronounced cooling effect for forested ecosystems, and particularly those that are generally tall. And then a final part of the study was that we just looked at long-term trends in air temperature from weather stations located in areas that were generally reforesting or not. Early in the time series, there's a little bit more uncertainty, but at least since 1950 or so, whether the metric is average annual temperature or growing season temperature, the number is negative, which means that the forest are cooler areas, or weather stations and reforested areas report cooler temperatures than weather stations in areas that didn't experience reforestation, on the order of about 0.5 degrees Celsius, which may seem small, but it is big when compared to the magnitude of warming experienced so far. We conclude that reforestation can't explain that entire warming hole over the eastern United States, but it certainly likely contributes to it. Okay. Last thing, then I'm done, is I want to say something about durability and permanence. You know, when it comes to nature-based climate solutions, we said we hope that these can be durable for a period of 100 years or so. But we also said that we don't really know what the future land carbon sink is, so durability is a particularly challenging problem when we think about the scientific justification for nature-based climate solutions, right? Saying that we have to be able to predict the future, but also that we can't predict the future. And we should consider a few different categories of threats. The first are these sort of natural threats, which particularly in forest amount to drought-driven mortality, insect outbreaks, and fire. But there are also very important social threats to durability. You know, the factors that determine whether a landowner will sustain a management practice shift into the future. And these are likely related to things like land ownership, the nature of the incentivization tools, as well as social norms and pressure. Okay. When it comes to the physical threats to durability, while our models don't agree about what the future holds, what we can do is learn from the past, or at least understand in a more statistical sense these physical risks. And so this is work that I didn't do. It was done by my collaborator, Bill Anderay from Utah, where he and his team calculated sort of the relative risk of forest die-off from wildfire, drought-driven mortality, and insect mortality across the United States. And then they had the observations, and they created this statistical model. And the point of this figure is that if you compare the Eastern United States across all three categories to the Western United States, the picture is much less rosy out west, where those less diverse and more water-limited ecosystems are at much greater risk of disturbance from fire, insects, and drought than in the music and biodiverse Eastern United States. And just to hammer that point home, I will show some data from a paper in prep led by my PhD student, Michael Benson, where what he did is he looked at how the 2012 drought, which some of you may remember, it was one of the worst droughts the Midwest has seen in 50 or 60 years. He used forest inventory data from the Forest Service to understand how that drought impacted tree growth and also mortality. And what he's showing here is the change in growth rate and mortality for a wide number of species. And I'm sure many of you are squinting your eyes to see how the white oaks fared versus the elms versus the tulip poplar, which you can do that if you want, but that's not the point of the figure. But it's very easy to get distracted by the trees. But what we want to do is focus on the forests instead of the trees, where the point is that these changes are really small. This was the worst drought in half a century, and the mortality rates were really quite low across this broader region. Okay, so we have forests that are relatively resilient to many of these climate feedbacks, at least thus far. There are exceptions, of course. The emerald ash borer has devastated the ash trees in our forest, and our few remaining hemlocks. We do have isolated hemlock stands, and they're probably next. Okay, so I don't want to say that everything's coming up roses, but in a general sense, our forests tend to be fairly resilient. Okay. The social threats to durability, on the other hand, are far less well understood. As part of our cover crop project, some colleagues of mine will be leading interviews and surveys of farmers and the agencies that represent them to better understand how they view cover crops as a climate solution. And we have a proposal under review involving Bernie Fischer, who I think I saw in the audience, and a few others that would do the same thing for reforestation if funded. Okay. So to summarize section 3, you know, if you can remember back, I think that there's a lot of opportunity to use all of these tools and models and approaches that were developed to understand carbon cycling in a general sense to reduce uncertainty around nature-based climate solutions. For example, using flux towers and satellites in addition to these more conventional stock-based approaches for carbon accounting. We have the tools we need to consider the mitigation and adaptation potential of biophysical impacts. Durability is a real challenge, but we don't know nothing, right? So we probably know enough to say a strategy like reforestation is a better idea in the Eastern United States than the Western United States. Though we certainly have a lot of work to do to understand social risks to durability. And just the final parting thought is, I alluded to this at the beginning, I actually think Indiana is a great place to be testing many of these strategies. It would be great to see Indiana sort of emerge as a leader in developing rigorous approaches for nature-based climate solutions. We have forests and we have farms, and we are a long state in the north-south direction, which means we have a wide sort of gradient in climate, which can be really useful from a scientific perspective. We have excellent state level forest inventory data from the DNR with the continuous forest inventory. And here our risks from drought, insects, and wildfires are in a relative sense low. And as I mentioned already, our elected leaders at both the state and federal level have already shown an interest in promoting these strategies. So it's a good place to be if you're a scientist like me that likes to study nature-based climate solutions. So with that, I think I am done, and I would be happy to answer questions.
Well, before we head into the Q&A section, I just want to say thank you so much. I'm simply amazed by how you can take this complex information and make it so accessible to a layperson like myself. This was just an excellent presentation, and I hope everybody on the call has learned as much as I have. So thank you so much. And I know we have quite a few questions that have already been submitted. Please feel free to continue submitting questions. We'll try to get to as many as possible, but we're planning to wrap up by about 8:30. So Kate, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Excellent. Hello, everybody. I'm the Communications and Membership Director at Sycamore Land Trust, and I have some exciting questions for everybody, so I'll get started. The first question is, it seems clear that nature-based solutions are far more uncertain than direct carbon emission reduction. What are some productive ways that citizens can participate in reducing the knowledge gaps that hamper the predictability of nature-based solutions?
You know, that is a great question. So if, first I would encourage citizens to continue doing the work that I assume many in the audience are already doing to encourage, I'm not allowed to say this, well, whatever. We need dramatic reductions to our anthropogenic emissions of CO2, and that is the solution, and we should continue to advocate as strongly as possible for that solution. When it comes to nature-based climate solutions, which we believe we also need, I do think there is opportunity to talk to decision makers about the need to invest in the science necessary to design robust systems. I think that's the best I've got right now. It's you kind of stumped me here with the first question. I'll have to think about that. I mean, I suppose that, if you are a landowner, if you have land, and I think that engaging with groups like the Sycamore Land Trust to think through, what are some ways that the land could be sustainably managed is another good measure. But yeah, in terms of closing scientific gaps, yeah, maybe that's one we need to think about a little bit more as a community. Thanks for that question.
I agree, it's a great question. Okay, the next question we have is, it seems that everyone's goal, especially large corporations, is net carbon neutrality by 2050. Is that an attainable goal? An attainable goal?
I think that probably depends on the sector. But I think that for some sectors, yes. I mean, we have to hope that it is, right? We need that's where we need to be in order to prevent the worst impacts of climate change. There will always, I mean, there are likely to be some emissions that are very difficult to abate on that timeline. And that's where the carbon dioxide removal strategies like nature-based climate solutions come into play. Where what gets dangerous is when a company is offsetting their emissions directly, right? Saying, okay, we've got this ton of CO2, coming out of this jet fuel over here, and we're going to cancel it out with this uptake in this forest over here. So this direct offsetting is what is most dangerous because of the scientific uncertainty about the durability of that ton of carbon over here in a forest. And there are a lot of groups with expertise that is much different than mine, thinking through alternative strategies beyond carbon offsetting to help companies reach their net zero goals or their emissions goals. And some of them involve sort of getting away from this offsets concept and just sort of encouraging companies to focus on emissions reductions within their, I think the word is value chain, don't ask me, but just different ways for companies to do their accounting. There are also proposals for companies to, instead of trading a ton of CO2 over here for a ton of CO2 over here, instead you sort of think about an exchange of monetary value, right? What is the financial cost of this ton of emitted carbon, and can you invest that in a more certain pathway for emissions reduction somewhere else, right? So just getting away from this idea that a ton of CO2 from jet fuel is the same as a ton of CO2 being sequestered by a forest. So there's a lot of people thinking about this, but the real danger is in the offsetting and the crediting right now.
Pretty fascinating. Okay, so the next question is, permanence of land-based carbon stores seems to be a large area of uncertainty and yet critical to the effectiveness of nature-based solutions. Can non-governmental organizations like land trusts make a difference at a sufficient scale to be meaningful?
I think so. I think all of this has been a major learning experience for me. I mean, a couple of years ago, really wouldn't have known anything about sort of the tools we have at our disposal to incentivize shifts in land practice management. But certainly conservation easements and other mechanisms that land trusts might use to encourage relatively durable shifts in management are some of our best examples of how this could be achieved at scale. And so I'm hopeful that grant that we have under review will be funded so we can begin to better understand the experience of landowners that participate in these programs, but also the organizations that administer them, and sort of figure out what might be the opportunities or barriers to, really scaling up those sorts of incentivization programs to scales that are really able to meaningfully impact climate change.
We certainly hope that too.
Mm-hmm.
Next question. In the illustration regarding reforestation, punctuated disturbance, and frequent fire showcasing declining oak species,
Mm-hmm.
What interval does the frequent fire refer to?
Yeah. Oh gosh. Here it is. I usually have Smokey Bear here. I forgot to copy him over from my other slideshow. But what this really means is that prior to colonization, the fire frequency was higher in the forests of the eastern United States. Sometimes indigenous tribes set fires intentionally as prescribed fire management, or they were natural ignitions. But as forestry grew throughout the 20th century across the nation, we had a very aggressive fire suppression program in place. It's still in place, which definitely reduced the frequency of fire on the landscape. As to the precise fire intervals, I'd have to check the notes in the paper, but that is what this era is supposed to represent. Smokey Bear.
Okay. Next question. How is the drone used for near surface remote sensing, or what are you measuring?
Yeah, great question. It's just a great opportunity to talk about all the things that I don't actually do, but my collaborators do. So I've never flown a drone. I do not have a drone flying license. So this is work being done by collaborators like Mallory Barnes and some other folks at IU that are better prepared to use these kind of data. But you're asking what we can measure. We can measure, sort of the standard stuff like reflectivity or greenness, which is useful information and also matches what we can see from satellites. We can also measure land surface temperature, which is really important for understanding the adaptation potential of these strategies. We can measure albedo with the drones. And some of these drones are big enough that we can deploy even more modern sensing platforms. So for example, there is, it's a measurement, it's called solar induced fluorescence, and it's a reflectivity in a very specific range of wavelengths that is really only activated during photosynthesis. And so solar induced fluorescence can be measured from drones and also from flux towers, which is another way to do near surface remote sensing, and also from space. And it is a direct proxy for photosynthesis. And it is a sort of remotely sensed data product that was not available a decade or two ago. And so, yeah, all sorts of things, but mostly temperature and reflectivity data.
What should local governments be doing to advance effective nature-based approaches to climate change mitigation in our communities?
It's a great question. I almost want to punt that to somebody in the audience that might have a better answer than me, because it is my understanding that the state of Indiana has been considering legislation to increase at least landowner access to carbon market systems for some time, and even convened a working group to explore the feasibility of these strategies. And the truth is, I think it's challenging, right? Whether or not, there are entities who can do the monitoring and verification at scales necessary for state governments to think big is very much an open question. And so on the one hand, I think, we need the science to catch up. But, on the other hand, many of these strategies, I will say, keep in mind, many of them have a tremendous justification for implementation on the basis of their co-benefits alone. And many of them could be generally viewed as no regrets strategies, or at least small regrets, right? Like cover crops are a pretty good idea, notwithstanding some evidence suggesting maybe some impacts on cash crop yield, which could probably be mitigated one way or another. More cover crops is generally a good idea. Reforestation offers a lot of benefits. And so, the danger again is, are we, if we're doing implementing these projects in a way that offsets a reduction of emission, that's where the danger is. But if we are simply implementing the projects while we are also reducing emissions at the same time, then the risk overall systematically become much lower. So I guess, government agencies might think of it less in an offsetting context, and then might find that the pathways to implementation become much easier.
Are there any newer studies focused on how carbon is stored or cycled in young, early successional forest, and similarly for intentional forest restoration?
Yeah. I think it's a question that deserves a lot more attention. In fact, we have a new grant from NASA and a very close look at the Odum curve, which I showed you. I'll have to see if I can find it again. It must have been back here. Here, this one. A very careful evaluation of what is the actual shape of this curve for forests undergoing natural succession in the East United States is going to be a major focus of the first year of that grant. Because, the theory was developed 50 years ago, and it was data that was a theory that was informed by data that were collected 50 or 60 years ago, before we had all these climate feedbacks in play. And every time I think about this paper that we hope to write, I'm like, surely somebody has done this already, but I haven't found any evidence that they have. So I guess you'll have to stay tuned a year. But I agree with whoever asked the question that it's a very interesting one, and one that we really should look at more closely.
That came from our education director, Mary Wells at Sycamore Land Trust. So
Okay.
that's why it's an excellent question. Next question. Can you estimate how much incremental cooling might be gained from reforestation of marginal ag lands?
Yes, we can. I'm not sure that this paper that Mallory is leading sort of has it presented directly as an estimate, but that's a great idea. I mean, it's on the order. The question is whether if we're talking about air temperature, it's a little bit harder. We can certainly estimate the change in surface temperature. That is very easy. We've done it already. The extent to which we made these maps sort of interpretable for somebody who wants precise answers to that question is another matter and something we should think through. But we can. It's usually on the order of 1 or 2 degrees Celsius when averaged over the entire year. But that cooling benefit really gets enhanced in summer, and particularly at midday in summer, when arguably we need that cooling benefit the most. And then to also understand the extent to which it affects the air, we have a few ways to do that by leveraging data from flux towers and other sources. And then we could sort of maybe apply sort of a empirical estimation to the mappable surface temperature data to understand changes in air temperature. So the answer to that question is yes, we can and have.
We're nearing the end of our time here. I think one of our last questions will be, what does improved forest management imply for individuals with forests and public entities?
Yeah. That I kind of steered clear of improved forest management in this talk, and that was purposeful, because I think I'm not sure that I'm fully equipped to weigh in on the mitigation potential of that strategy. The general thinking, the most commonly, particularly for the East United States, the idea is that if you increase your harvest rotation, the period between your harvests, that over the long term, this will result in an increase in carbon on the landscape. And so, I mean, that's the message, but, the downside is that at least in the short term, until you sort of catch up to the new equilibrium, there are issues with, well, you're reducing harvest, right? So what does that mean if you depend on that harvest for income? Or what does it mean for leakage, right? Are you simply causing more trees to be harvested somewhere else? I think it's a tricky one. And so I have not invested a lot personally in that particular strategy, which is not to say that I want to weigh in at one way or the other. Simply, I think it's tricky, that one.
Well, we have reached the end of the list of our questions. Thank you, everybody, for submitting such interesting follow-up questions. I'll say I certainly hope that we close the knowledge gap soon, and meanwhile, Sycamore will continue to build more support for reforestation and constructing wetlands. We are going to share the link that Dr. Novick referred to, the summary report, in an email containing the recording of this presentation, which will come in a few days. We do not have our chat function enabled, so she's not able to share it that way. We'll share it over email. And Sycamore certainly hopes our forests will be there for at least 100 years and many, many more than that. So thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight, and a big thank you to you, Dr. Novick, for all of your time in this fascinating presentation for a very important topic.
Thank you so much for having me. It was fun.